The real tale of the Exodus from Mitzrayim begins in a section of the hagadah known as Tzeir Lamad. Much of the earlier parts of the hagadah are merely introductory, setting a mood, allowing the children to ask questions, in fact stimulating their questions, introducing all sorts of surprises, whether it's the karpas, eating before the actual bread, washing hands without a bracha. So many surprises to elicit interest and to create healthy questions. Describing people, Rabbanim, in Bnei Brak, who despite their scholarship, their familiarity with the miracle of Egypt, because of their familiarity and their scholarship, spent the entire evening until the wee hours of the morning until they budded Kriya Shema, describing the Nes of Mitzrayim, describing 4 different types of children, many different answers, many different angles to the story. But the actual story begins in the section known as Tzei Ulamad. And very often we spend so much time and interest in the introductory sections that are intended just to set an ambience and a mood. They're stylistic. They're not the tale itself. They're just introducing the tale. By the time we reach Tzei Ulamad, that 4 pasuk section, these 4 psukim from Parshat Ki Tavo, which actually tell the tale and describe the Exodus, the descent, the persecution, the prayer. We're left with little time. It's late. Children are exhausted. The food is burning or getting cold, and Chatzos is looming, and we don't spend as much time as we should on the actual hagadah, on the actual story. The beginning of the section of Tzeir Lamad, that first pasuk in Parshas Ki Savo, Arami Oved Avi, very interesting beginning. We're here to describe the events surrounding the Exodus from Egypt, the persecution, and yet we return historically to Lavan, to Yaakov's experience with Lavan, Arami Oved Avi. And at least the way the Haggadah understands Arami Oved Avi, this is a reference to Lavan, that Lavan desired to, Arami is a reference to Lavan, Oved. It's a very strange grammar, but he wanted to destroy La'abed, La'ashmid, La'rogu, La'abed, Arami Oved Avi. And it's strange because he's contrasted with Paro. The Haggadah says Paro only intended to eliminate the males, but Lavan Bikesh La'akar et Hakol. It's strange because reading the Chumash, reading Sefer Bereshis, we don't detect the same hatred, the same anti-Semitism in Lavan that we do in Paro, which is just so explicit in Sefer Shmos. But yet the Haggadah highlights Lavan's genocidal plans and begins the story with Lavan's intention. Lavan chased Yaa'kov. Lavan, in the end of Parshas Vayetze, would have murdered Yaa'kov, were it not for HaKadosh Baruch Hu's intervention, were it not for that dream in which HaKadosh Baruch Hu threatens and warns him. The Rav remarked that in Lavan's pursuit of Yaakov, which was not just a pursuit of Yaakov, but a pursuit of Yaakov, his own daughters, Rachel and Leah, his own grandchildren, 12 Shvatim. In that pursuit, we sense the genocidal nature of anti-Semitism. That Lavan is trapped in his hatred of Yaakov, in his jealousy of Yaakov, that he's even willing to shoot himself in the leg. He's even willing to torture, to pursue, to murder, potentially, his own daughters, his own grandchildren. And anti-Semitism is just so vicious and so genocidal. We've heard stories about the Nazis in the Second World War diverting massive resources, even as the war effort began to crumble. Massive resources, personnel, energy, munitions, to torturing Jews, to murdering Jews, to marching Jews on death marches, when perhaps had those resources been dedicated solely to the war effort, perhaps they would have been more successful, chas v'shalom, at least militarily. And there's a perspective on anti-Semitism, how irrational it is, how anti-Semitism takes a different form throughout the generations. In Lavan's genocidal plans, we don't just sense the psychopathic nature of anti-Semitism, but the fact that it takes so many different forms. Paro's anti-Semitism at least is professed, because the Jews are multiplying too rapidly. They're gaining undue influence. Yosef had already established this center of influence in Goshen, and clearly Egyptians felt beholden or grateful to Yosef and his tribes. And they feared that this political influence would be used in a subversive, would be used to sabotage Egypt in the event of an attack. Lavan's anti-Semitism had little to do with that. Lavan's anti-Semitism accused Yaakov of lying, of swindling, of cheating, of deceiving. Anti-Semitism evolves in each generation in a different mask, because pure hatred just can't be preached without it being enveloped or enveloped or cast in a pretext or a premise. So for thousands of years, Jews were accused of killing Jesus, and then when Christian dogma became less compelling, so in the 20th century, Jews were murdered because they were a sub-Aryan race, Hitler's form of anti-Semitism. And in our current context, racism isn't as popular, so racism can no longer be held as the pretext for anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism has to be cloaked in geopolitical terms, that the Jewish state is imperialistic and colonistic and invading and conquering territories. But anti-Semitism at its root is a hatred of Jews, is a jealousy of our challenge and our mission and our great responsibility to present the message to humanity. And returning to Lavan's form of anti-Semitism, on the one hand demonstrates a psychopathic nature, on the other hand that in each generation, b'chol dor v'dor, omdim oleinu l'chalosenu, but with a very different perspective and with very different reasons and with very different pretexts. So we begin the story by returning back to the story of Lavan. In fact, one of the phrases in this first pasuk, Arami Oved Avi, Vayered Mitzrayim Vayagar Sham B'Misei Me'at. They lived there with very few. There were only 70 souls that descended to Egypt, and of course, they became a large 3 million strong people nation. But that phrase, Misei Me'at, only appears one other time in Sefer Bereshis, when Lavan reminisces that Yaakov descended, or in this case, traveled to Aram Naharaim b'Misei Ma'at, with few people, and he multiplied under Lavan. Of course, when Yaakov arrives in Aram Naharaim, there's only one soul, and he multiplies this entire entourage. Then ultimately, Yaakov and 70 souls descend to Egypt. But that phrase, Misei Ma'at, is a textual link to fuse the challenge of Lavan and the challenge of Paro, and Yaakov gets caught in the middle. Yaakov assumed, after he escaped Lavan and had appeased Esav and had delayed Esav's aggression, that he would achieve that long-awaited period of tranquility and settle in the land of his avos. Vayeshev Yaakov v'eretz megurei aviv. Yaakov had hoped, had dreamed that perhaps all of his challenges and trials and tribulations were over, had concluded, and he could just quietly settle into Jewish history, and that's not the fate HaKadosh Baruch Hu had in mind for Yaakov. But the truth is that some Rishonim interpret the phrase Arami Oved Avi not as a reference to Lavan's genocidal plans, as the hagadah clearly assumes, as a reference to Yaakov, that Yaakov was a wandering man, and he wandered through Aram. Oved doesn't mean to destroy, but Oved means lost, which is the more literal grammatical translation. He was a lost man. Yaakov was never really lost, but Yaakov realized that he would not acquire the stability in Israel that he had hoped for. All of our avos were shepherds. Shepherd takes from the land, can't plant, can't settle. Yitzchak was the only of the three avos who was successful as a farmer to establish a permanent residence in Eretz Yisrael. All of our avos were Roei Tzor, and they're very aware of this when they introduce themselves to Paro. And the Galus had begun even before Yaakov descends into Egypt, because the avos were fated to live in Israel without full sovereignty. They were always challenged, whether Avram's challenge was to acquire land in Hebron to bury Sarah, or Yitzchak to find or to secure water rights, or Yaakov to journey in and journey out of Eretz Yisrael. So we begin the hagadah not just with reminiscing about Lavan's genocidal plans, but that the Galus really began well before Yaakov descends with the loss of sovereignty. and our struggle, of course, in the modern context, not just to return to the land geographically, but to regain that sovereignty. Arami Ovi Abi.